Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are in the world. I am Tigress Osborne. I'm the chair of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, also known as NAFA, and welcome to the NAFA webinar series. Today, we are joined by funeral director Adrienne Briere, and we're going to be talking about fat death planning. We also want to let you know, and we'll introduce you to Adrienne and get started with her in just a moment. Our interpreters today from Pro Bono ASL are Lex and Lavender. We encourage you to support the important work of Pro Bono ASL, and you can find more about them at probonoasl.com. We also encourage you to learn more, in addition to today's dialogue about fat death planning, by visiting our new death planning resources hub on the NAFA website. You can find that at nafa.org, NAAFA.org/death planning. And we'll be adding over the next few weeks and months more and more resources relating to other aspects of end-of-life care and what happens to fat people in our bodies after life. We'll be building out those resources. There's also a form there where you can make suggestions or share ideas. And of course, you are welcome to make suggestions, share ideas, and enter questions in the chat if you are here with us live today. I also want to thank you. Today is December 1st, and it is Thursday, December 1st. And on Giving Tuesday this week, we launched our end-of-year giving campaign with a goal of raising $10,000. We are already over the $2,000 mark, and so grateful to those of you who have given, who have liked and shared, who have encouraged others to give. We are able to offer webinars such as this free to FAT community and our allies because of the generous support of folks like you. So you can always support NAFA's programming by going to nafa.org/give to make a contribution to the work that we are doing. With no further ado, I want to introduce you to today's special guest. Adrienne Briere is a graduate of the Humber Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning, aka Humber College, in Toronto. She was licensed as a funeral director in 2009. She has 13 years of experience helping families of all races, religions, belief systems, and sizes through the most emotional and vulnerable time in their lives. Ladies and gentlemen and friends of all gens, please welcome Adrienne Briere to the NAFA webinar series. Adrienne, how are you doing today?
Fantastic. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for all the ways that you contributed already to helping us do some of the thought work and some of the research that led to the beginnings of our death planning resources page on our website. Before we get into some of the specifics of death planning, let's just talk a little bit more about you and how you got to be a funeral director.
So I started university in forensic science. I've always been kind of weird in that respect. And it was after my first program change, my mother actually suggested it to me, lumped in with counselor and social worker. And it wasn't until the end of my second year that I looked into it and thought, you know what, I could do that. I did finish my bachelor's degree. I have a degree in sociology from the University of Windsor. But needless to say, everybody who knows me was not surprised at all to find out that I was going to be pursuing this as a career, which I took as a compliment. And that's kind of the rest of history.
What was it about you that made it unsurprising to folks that you would go into death work as a career?
I don't think so much it's death work. It's the helping people. My one girlfriend mentioned that I was always the voice of her conscience in the back of her head in her speech at my wedding. So it's always just been helping people. The death stuff doesn't weird me out, and I'm not squeamish in terms of that. So.
Well, on the note of squeamishness, I should provide a little bit of a content warning here. We are going to be talking really candidly about death, including what happens to bodies. And so that might include some graphic details. So we just want to advise you of that. It will also potentially include some discussion of specific weight-related numbers. As those of you who are with us on a regular basis know, we don't do diet talk here. We're careful with the use of the terminology obese or obesity because of the way it pathologizes pathologizes fat people. But in some cases, in referring to resources that are available, there might be terms that some people might find objectionable, and there certainly will be some discussion of numbers because numbers are relevant in the case of this discussion. So just a warning for folks about that. So Adrienne, let's go back to your early days as a funeral director. When did it become clear to you that there was something different about working with fat bodies?
Right off the top, it's size matters in terms of us moving people, transferring people if we need to have extra hands, just because like the term dead weight has some significance behind it. And we're physically moving people and caskets. And so we need to protect ourselves for safety reasons. We need to ensure that we're not hurting ourselves, because if we hurt ourselves, then we're no good to do our job. It's a lot of physical work.
And where did this come up in your training? When you were getting licensed or when you were doing other training, where did issues of body size and accessibility come up?
Oh, right off the top, even during my 40-hour observations before I even started school, there are a lot of considerations that you have to make in terms of that. Are you going to be able to fit a casket through a doorway? And that's even a standard size casket. If it's a narrow doorway, you're not getting through. Did the death occur at home? Are we going to be able to move around with what's there? It's always been a consideration, and it's something that we learn about right off the top.
So it sounds like for professionals in your industry, size is at the top of mind. Do you find that size is at the top of mind for the folks who are coming to you for your services? Or do you find that people really don't start thinking about it until they hit some kind of barrier that's related to size?
50-50. There are some families that are absolutely aware of the size and will tell us and let us know and are receptive to hearing things that we have to suggest, and some are not. Some push back, some are in disbelief. So it all depends on their mindset when they're coming in, which runs the gamut, because you got emotions involved as well too.
Right. Emotions about the death and sometimes emotions about the fat.
Yep.
So what is it like for you if you are dealing with a family who wants to avoid talking about their loved one's size, or other family or other loved ones who want to avoid talking about the deceased size? What happens then?
It's unfortunately a conversation that we need to have, especially if it's something related to, we need a larger size casket, or we need to talk about if it's cremation, are we going to be able to cremate at the crematorium we're going to? Because it is a size restriction. It's inches, it's measurements. It's not so much weight, but it's inches and measurements that are the issue.
So so I should also say, Adrienne, as you heard in her bio, is in Toronto. NAFA is based in the US. So obviously there may be some specifics that are different depending on where you live across our two countries and also globally. We also are focusing today on the burial and cremation industry. So Adrienne has experience working with folks of lots of different traditions, and you're welcome to ask questions about particular traditions, but we'll be focusing a lot on what most people would call traditional burial and cremation, even though we know that there are many, many other kinds of traditions around death. So Adrienne, in terms of burial and cremation, let's just go through like some of the areas where size matters and how it impacts folks. You mentioned a couple of them as you started talking.
Yes.
Right? But what's the checklist?
So the first one would be, where has the death occurred? Is it in a hospital? Is it a nursing home? Is it at home? At home poses the most, I don't want to say problems, but the most things that could happen just because if they're in a basement or on a second floor, we may need to have additional staff there in order to bring the person into our care. Next up would be casket or cremation container. It's a matter of physically fitting the person in and making sure that they're comfortable, that we're not squishing somebody in. And there's a whole bunch of things that go into that. Again, it's not necessarily weight. If somebody has really broad shoulders, we may look at, or really, really tall, we may be looking at an oversized casket for comfort's sake. Then it's burial cremation. Again, we're talking inches, feet, measurements. Is a casket going to be able to fit into a grave? If it's an oversized casket, is it going to be able to fit into a cremation retort? If not, we're going to have to think of something, another crematorium to go to, maybe brainstorm and purchasing the plot next to it and burying in the middle of the two. So there's a lot of things that can come up in terms of that.
And what about transportation?
Transportation usually isn't an issue. A lot of our equipment can handle a decent amount of weight. There are some that are certified for up to 1,000 pounds. In terms of the vehicles, that's not an issue either. Most funeral homes use nondescript minivans for transfer purposes from the place of death to the funeral home. So the vast majority of people here have probably been in traffic beside a vehicle from a funeral home with a deceased person in the back and have not even realized it. We're not always using the big fancy coach for everything.
And so let's talk about terminology a little bit. Coach is another word for
hearse.
And all these C words that we talk about, the things we put bodies in, casket, coffin, container. What's the difference between those things? Why are there different words for those?
Because they're all different things. So here, by definition, a casket is a container with 4 sides that has an interior and a pillow. A cremation container has no interior, but it's got 4 sides. A coffin is what you see Dracula in. It has 6 sides and has that traditional shape that you would think of.
That's sort of wider at the shoulders.
Wider at the shoulders, yeah. Yes. Yeah. So they use coffins over in Europe a lot. They don't have caskets over there.
Are all of those vessels available in larger sizes?
Cremation containers and caskets, yes. Coffins, I don't have a lot of experience with, only because the only ones I've dealt with are ones that have been repatriated here from Europe, and they've all been roughly the same size.
And what about folks who might be bigger than the oversized ones that are commercially available? What do they do?
So our manufacturer goes up to a quadruple oversized casket and cremation container. We also have had cremation containers custom made by one of our suppliers, if that's something that needs to be done.
What are things that people might need to think about in terms of planning memorial services and size?
What type of, do you want a casket present? Do you want an urn present? An urn's not necessarily that big of a deal, as how much is left in terms of cremated remains is bone density, not physical size. So that's the first hurdle that you need to tackle is, if you want a casket and you're pre-plan for something that for that day. Like if you were to walk out and something happens, plan for that. Things can always change when the time comes by your family if need be, but plan for the now in a lot of respects. But that's typically the biggest thing.
So you just mentioned urns and the misconception around body size and what that means in terms of ashes. Can we talk about that a little bit more? Because I know that there are some pop culture references, some jokes out there in pop culture about fat people dying and the family or loved ones needing, several urns because they were so big that they had all of these ashes. What's wrong with that misconception?
So everything organic burns away. The only things that are left are minerals and non-organic matter, which for the most part is your bones, is the skeletal system. And even then, there's some things in there that burn away as well. So I probably count on one hand how many times we've had a second container because not everything fits into one. Not a single one of those people were fat.
What are some other misconceptions that are out there in pop culture or out there in the sort of greater consciousness around what must be happening to fat bodies after they die?
Oh, I would have to say that like you need to cremate. Like there's no other way, which is not true at all. You always hear issues that people magically have with fat people in cremation because they think grease fires, and that doesn't happen either. Like there's fail safes built into the system to prevent stuff like that from happening. We have ways of scheduling and timing things that we know to take care of stuff like that in advance to ensure that nothing like that happens.
So folks, I'm going to keep asking Adrienne some questions about her work, but you are welcome to start entering questions in the chat, those of you who are here with us live today. Adrienne, is there, can you talk about alternatives to traditional burial and cremation? Is that something that you do as a funeral director?
So I have not had any experience with anything beyond traditional burial or cremation. I know that there are a couple of places. There's one in particular in Washington State that practices composting, and they have mentioned that size is not an issue for them. Their vessels look to be quite large in terms of, they need to have large containers in order to be able to do human composting. Aquamation, also not an issue in terms of the chamber size and the process as well. There was a facility not too far from myself, but they're still in the midst of getting that up and running here where I am. Those really are the big ones in terms of.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
Those are the main ones that we've covered in our death planning resources as well. There is a little bit of information there, friends, under care for your remains or your loved one's remains that talks about aquamation and composting. There's also a little bit of information about donating bodies to science. And Adrienne, can you talk about how embalming is or is not different for larger bodies? Because one of the things that we are often given as an excuse for why fat people cannot donate their bodies to science beyond a certain weight is because the embalming will make those bodies too heavy to be, they'll be too unwieldy to deal with in a teaching environment. Mm-hmm. Is that true? And what's different about embalming?
So the embalming that we do in the funeral industry for funerals is a whole lot different than what the medical community and donating your body to science is. It uses the same chemicals, but it's two different processes.
So actually, let me stop you there because I should have asked a more basic question first, and we might want to go back to a little bit more basics on some of these things because we don't want to assume that everybody knows what all of these procedures are. So, what is embalming, and why do we do it?
So the definition that we learn in school, it is the preservation, disinfection, and restoration of dead human remains for funeral purposes. For the most part, people think, we're removing the blood. In some respects, yes, we are. We use the circulatory system to our advantage in terms of injecting a preserving chemical into a body to preserve it. And we mix the solutions ourselves based on cause of death, how long it's been, condition, how long we need to keep them for. And I've had colleagues have full open casket visitations months after the passing because it just situation that's what needed to happen.
So bodies don't have to be embalmed after death.
No,
Why?
There is no, where I am, there is no legal requirement for embalming. The only time that we have to embalm is if we're repatriating a deceased out of the country. I have not come across a country that does not require embalming for a body to go across country lines. The only caveat to that is going from Canada to the US. If you're driving across, then generally you're fine. But where I am, there is no legal requirement. There are situations where we will suggest it strongly, but no legal requirement.
Okay, so now that we've covered what it is and what it does to the body, please go back to what you were starting to say about the difference between why, medical and scientific embalming versus memorial service.
So for embalming for funeral purposes, we do drain. We do drain fluid from the body, blood, embalming chemical that makes the whole circuit. With medical embalming, there is no drainage. They use gravity, they let the chemical go in, and it's a multi-stage process. So there is some truth to them saying you can't manipulate a fat person who's been medically embalmed, because they keep the cadavers for 2-3 years before cremation takes place in some instances. So there is a little bit of truth to that aspect of it.
So if there are people who are over, generally we find in our research that the cutoff is around 200, at the most 250 pounds for folks who want to donate their bodies. And if you're over that, is there something else you can do if you want your body to benefit science besides donate your whole body for use as a cadaver?
I personally am not aware of anything else that you could do. You could potentially look into some private donation scenarios. Body Worlds would be one for an example. But I believe that they have a weight cutoff as well. I personally have not looked into it.
Can you explain what Body Worlds is?
Body Worlds is and there are a few others as well, where the body has undergone a preservation called plastination, and they manipulate the bodies into certain poses, and it's almost like a museum that you can walk through, that you can see people in various activities, different layers. It's quite fascinating, actually. I haven't had the chance to do a tour of it myself, but I have a lot of friends who have, and most of them are quite amazed at what they've been able to do. But that is something that you could look into.
Yeah, we haven't researched Body Worlds or any of the kind of exhibits like that to see what their requirements are related to weight and size, but we will, and we'll bring that to our death planning website soon. Adrienne, there are a couple of comments and questions in the chat about green burial. Is that something that you've done? And can you talk about ways that like what that is, and are there ways that it may be different for larger bodies?
So green burials, usually there's no embalming, there's no metal, it's all natural fibers. Sometimes they'll use a casket, sometimes they won't. And a lot of the times it's a natural wooded area or an open field that's been designated as a green cemetery. The only difference really would be ensuring that the grave is deep enough and wide enough in order to bury the person. We have one that's about 2 hours away from here, and we've dealt with them once. And the deceased was wrapped in a linen shroud, so there was no casket.
We also found that when we were doing some research, we saw some smaller manufacturers that make caskets from everything from cardboard to a sort of wicker rattan kind of situation. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of folks, if they've never looked into anything other than what's considered traditional burial in the U.S., they're not aware that there are lots of options for what caskets can be like.
And where I am, we don't, if a family wants to bring in their own casket. That's fine, so long as it's safe and it meets the requirements of the cemetery. I have not dealt with like a wicker or rattan one as of yet, but have definitely dealt with a couple of different other manufacturers in terms of caskets. So it's, there's a lot of different things out there that you can use. It's just a matter of looking and doing your research.
And do we need to be thinking about legality around what we can use? Like, can I just decide I want to be, my friend does metalworking, I want to be buried in this aluminum box. Can I do that?
It depends on the cemetery bylaws. The cemetery ultimately will determine whether or not it's acceptable. The funeral home will determine whether it's safe. Like, for instance, if the handles can be carried, things along those lines. But as long as it meets the requirements of the cemetery where I am, that's fine.
So we should remind you again that like there may be different legal requirements where you live about some of these things. Some of these processes like human composting are only legal in certain parts of the U.S., although that is changing every year. So we will stay up to date with that as much as possible on our resource page. But you can always ask your funeral director those questions. Adrienne, what are some things that you wish people knew ahead of time that they need to tell a funeral director when they make first contact?
So the biggest thing is if it's a death in the home or a death that's not in an institution, a nursing home, hospice, hospital, because size and location, like I mentioned earlier, do matter in those scenarios. If we know that they're 400 pounds in the basement, okay, we might need to send 4 people as opposed to our typical 2 in order to ensure that everybody, including the deceased person, gets out of the house safely. And that ultimately is the goal, is we want to do things safely and with dignity. So that's just information that we need. A lot of the times we will ask those questions while on the phone if we can. Sometimes the person is just too emotional that we're not able to go into it gently. That's where a lot of the times, especially if it's an unexpected passing, having the police call us first is a good thing, because we can always ask the police those questions as opposed to traumatizing people further. If it's an expected death, usually that's a little bit of a different situation. I find they're a little bit more prepared.
Can you talk about what the difference is between what a coroner does and what a mortician or funeral director does to the body, and how, if there are any differences there related to size?
So a coroner is the person who investigates the death. They can order the investigation. They are not the ones that perform the autopsies as a general rule, at least here. They don't. We have pathologists that do that. They are not typically involved in removing the deceased from the location of death. That still falls to us. But we're the ones that take over when they're done. So after the autopsy or the investigation is complete, we transfer them from wherever they are, whether it's the medical examiner's office or a local hospital. And then that's where we step in and we start what we need to do.
And have you ever seen it be the case that body size was related to what triggered the need for an autopsy or an investigation in any way?
At times, yes, especially if it was unexpected. If there wasn't anything that could clearly point to a cascade of events to cause somebody's death.
So I just want to highlight a couple of things from the chat. One person points out that their experience with Body Worlds actually ended with a really fat phobic presentation of a fat person's body. So proceed with caution if you decide to investigate any of those kinds of educational presentations of bodies, and we'll look into that as we add that to our research list. Someone has pointed out the Funeral Consumers Alliance, which was also just brought, we're adding to our resource list as well, and you can find them at funerals.org. Are there other organizations or resources, Adrienne, that off the top of your head that you recommend for people who specifically want to, who are specifically needing information about planning for FAT-related concerns around death?
Check out your state or your province's licensing authority. A lot of the times there could be a professional organization as well too. This is one area where it's specific to your geographical location, because everything, it revolves specific to that state or province. So for instance, here in Ontario, it's the Bereavement Authority of Ontario, which has a lot of consumer information for people who are starting down the path, whether it's pre-arranging or whether a death has occurred.
Well, let's talk about pre-arranging. Mm-hmm. Why do I want to plan this far ahead instead of just letting my family deal with it when I die?
There are 3 things that are certain in life: birth, death, and taxes. So pre-planning, one, it makes your wishes known, because a lot of people don't like having that conversation with people. A lot of people are scared of the idea of their own mortality. So getting it in writing is very helpful for families when the death does occur. If you want specific things to happen, it's also a good thing to have it written down and prearranged. It also will save you money. Sometimes a lot of money. Like for instance, here where I am, when you prearrange, you essentially lock in your prices. So unless you change services or you add things, if the money gets invested and if it doesn't gain enough interest to cover the cost, the funeral home takes that as a loss. And I can say with certainty, there are a lot more funerals with losses than profits. So prearranging is a very, very smart thing to do for the consumer.
How do I get started if I want to do some prearranging or some pre-planning with my loved ones for what happens to me?
First thing would be to call your local funeral home. A lot of them will have a pre-arrangement director on staff, or will have somebody who deals with pre-arrangements, because it is a little different than at need, which is what I typically do. And they will walk you through all of it. You're also making decisions with a clear head and without emotions involved as well, too, which makes it a lot easier as well.
So, and you mentioned that pre-arranging saves some money. Let's talk about the financial aspect of FAT death planning, because as with many things in life where we call the upcharges for larger size things, the FAT tax, what does the FAT tax look like in terms of death planning?
All depends on where you are. So I know in the States, there are a lot of places that will charge extra for oversized caskets or containers, will charge an overweight charge. Same thing with crematoriums. There's an extra fee if you're over a certain weight. Where I am, there isn't anything like that, especially where I work. There is no additional charge for cremation. We do not charge extra for the oversized caskets and cremation containers. There isn't an additional fee if we need to send additional staff out if the passing is at home. We are very inclusive in terms of everybody's on an even playing field in terms of that. Everybody deserves dignity, even in death.
Some people would say, especially in death.
Especially in death. You're at your most vulnerable. And the thing is we're being trusted by your family to take care of you. And if we can't do that to the best of our abilities, then there's a little bit of a problem.
What about burial plots? We saw in our research that especially at older cemeteries, there may be a need for 2 plots or for an extended size plot. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So a lot of newer cemeteries are making more allowances in terms of their grave sizes. You hit the nail on the head. With a lot of the older ones, there isn't a lot of space, because when the cemeteries opened, the coffins that they were using were a lot smaller than what they are now. In instances like that, yes, you may have to purchase a second plot or look at an extended length or look at a different garden or a different cemetery altogether, depending on what you want to do and where you want to be.
So what happens if I have pre-planned a funeral and then I'm much larger when I die and my plot or the casket that I've chosen or any of those things no longer accommodate me? Then what happens?
So if it's the casket, we will, if there's an oversized of that version, we will offer that. If not, we will offer the family some choices that are within the same price range. If we can't provide something, whether a lot of the times that happens if the casket's been discontinued and is no longer manufactured, or we don't have access to it, we have to offer greater or equivalent or greater in value. We, a lot of the times, unless they're choosing something that's ridiculously more expensive, we just call it an even trade, so to speak, in terms of going from what was selected to what we're actually using. On the cemetery side, a lot of the times that's a conversation with the cemetery itself. It may mean moving to a different garden, to a different plot, to accommodate the measurements. It all depends on what kind of measurements we're looking at. If it's something close, maybe able to get away with it, but that usually is a question for a cemetery.
So it would happen on really a case-by-case basis.
Yes.
What you are able to talk about this as somebody who self-identifies as fat and has positive use of that terminology. This is easy for you to talk about these two topics that are so difficult for many people, size and death. Do you find that your colleagues are equally informed and sensitive around body size at the level you would hope they would be?
Yes. The people that I work directly with are very open-minded. They are absolutely fantastic. They are very welcoming. We work as a team and a very cohesive team.
And do you see that across the industry, or do you think that where you are a funeral director in particular is unique in that way?
It's location by location. Where I am and our immediate sister chapels, we all do work very well together. We have really good communication between each other as in terms of the care of the people in our care. So I have come across places that may not be quite as open in terms of communication. So I consider myself lucky to work with the people that I work with.
If someone does have a challenging experience or an offensive or upsetting or insensitive experience related to body size when they're pre-planning for themselves or when they are planning for a loved one, what would you recommend that they do about that?
To talk to either the professional association or the licensing authority in your geographical location. That is usually who you would go to if you feel like you're not getting anywhere at the actual location. I would start with the manager at the funeral home first and kind of go from there, as you would with almost any other retail situation. I'm reviewing the chat to make sure I haven't missed comments or questions here. I do see a question about whether green or natural burial plot and sizing and cost are related in any ways that pretty much work the same way as if you're doing any other kind of burial. I am honestly not sure. The only one near us is in a forested area. So a lot of the times they're choosing a space for burial based on, do they have enough space to physically dig? And there isn't anybody else there. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
And I do see that our administrative director, Darlene, did a little research as we've been talking, and currently Body Worlds is not taking donations, but we will, keep an eye on that in case that changes, and also keep an eye out for reports about how they are representing larger bodies in their exhibits. Thank you for that, Darlene. Friends, I just want to remind you we have just a few minutes left, so if you have other questions that you want to put in the chat for Adrienne or other experiences that you want to share, now is a great time to do that. Adrienne, do you, is there something that you, please forgive me if this is similar to what I've already asked, but is there something that you really wish people would know about this subject that's just not part of people's concept of what death and preparing for death is?
I want people to be able to feel like they can talk about it. It's such a taboo topic, whether you're talking about your own death or death of loved ones. And the thing is, it's going to happen to everyone at some point. So being able to have those open conversations with your loved ones about what you want, what they want, different options, things like that. It's really important. I've had more families than I can count sit in front of me and okay, what would you like to do? We have no idea because we did not have any of those conversations. And they are at a loss. And I really do have to take their hand and walk them through very gingerly the entire process. Families that come in that have an idea tend to not need as much guidance. Families that come in and I have a pre-arrangement file in front of me, those generally are seamless because I can have that, okay, this is what was pre-arranged. Do we want to stick with this? Nope. Okay, we'll switch gears. If yes, we're going to stick with it. Great. When are we going to do this? So on and so forth. I find the pre-arrangements, when they go at need, quickest arrangement I had, 10 minutes in and out, because they knew what they wanted. I had all the information. It was all prepaid. They knew what they wanted to do because they had those conversations. I've been in an office with a family for 6 hours because they had no idea. And even at the end of that 6 hours, we were no further ahead.
What advice do you have for folks who know that their loved ones are fat phobic and are not going to want to talk about their bodies or deal with the realities of their bodies, or are going to be embarrassed about some of the realities of accommodating their bodies? Do you have advice for folks who are in that situation?
One, find somebody who you trust, who is open to you, loving to you, that you know will carry through what you want to do. That would be the first thing, because the thing is, and I'm sure people can relate to this as well too, is those people who are fat phobic, it doesn't matter how hard you knock their head off the table, they may not change. Their opinions may not change, and you might, in some cases, it's not worth the fight, especially when you're talking about what you want to have happen when you're not here. So finding somebody who can follow through is really important, and taking the steps to ensure that that person is the one who's going to be making all the decisions for you when you are gone.
I will just add a personal observation there, something that we've seen in watching, as a 53-year-old organization, we've had, we're at an era of our organizational development where lots of folks who were involved in the early days of NAFA are passing. And we're also, or have long passed. And we also, of course, see people of all ages and across all different kinds of lives and identities who are dying for a variety of reasons. And so we get requests for memorials or people wanting to give in folks' names, things like that. And one of the things that we do see sometimes from people in fat community is that their loved ones won't use pictures of them from when they were fat in their memorials. So I just want to share with folks that if it is important to you for your loved ones to honor what you looked like, that you make sure that they know that, because sometimes they think they're doing you a service by not showing your fat photos, but I can say, speaking for myself, like, this is what I look like. This is who I am. Of course, I want you to use these pictures of me, not some picture from high school, just so it can be my thin picture. Right. And so friends, I encourage you to talk explicitly with your loved ones about what you want in that regard as well.
Yep.
Have you seen, Adrienne, families or loved ones disagree about things like that?
Oh, what photo to use comes up regardless of the person's size. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, especially if they've been ill. I find a lot of families will choose an older photo if they've been ill the last couple of years because they didn't feel good about how they looked. So that kind of got into their family's head and stuck. Some families want to choose, especially like the older portrait photographs from like the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. Mind you, they're beautiful. Nobody looks like that now. So using a more recent photo alongside that one, it works beautifully. But the photo, probably one of the biggest fights between families is what photo to use.
So the bottom line is, if you have strong feelings about how you want it done, pre-plan as much as possible and be as open with your loved ones as possible about what you want and explicit. And what if I can't afford to do the pre-planning?
So this boils down to geographical location as well, too. There are various options in terms of how to pre-plan. A lot of the times you can pay on a monthly basis as well. Your pre-arrangement director will be able to go through those steps with you to make it affordable. There have been instances where they've just done the absolute basic and then family can worry about what specific they want to do when the passing comes, but at least the basic is done. It's all based on what you want, what you can afford, and your budget.
But talking about it is the biggest thing.
Talking about it is the biggest thing. Uh-huh.
What do you think about the way that death is and the funeral industry is portrayed in popular culture? Does that help us talk more about it? Is like shows like Adrienne knows I've been watching 6 Feet Under recently. Shows like that, or the Daisies. What's the Daisy show?
Pushing Daisies.
Pushing Daisies. Thank you. Or other like movies, references, popular. Popular YouTubers like Ask a Mortician, like folks who are, the ways that we're encountering death in popular culture. Do you think that those create stigma or reduce stigma, or what do you think?
Almost both. You get a show like 6 Feet Under, and since that's really the most recent one, that's the one that people always go to and the most popular one. So you get the drama side of it, the family drama side of it, which as a general rule, that doesn't happen. But their production staff and their set designers did actually, I personally think, a very good job at setting up what a funeral home looks like, what a embalming room looks like. That's a real embalming machine. Those are real tools that we use. Those are real chemicals in those cupboards. So they opened up a lot in terms of getting people to understand it. I watched it long before I got into the business as well, too. So walking into school and the funeral home and seeing, that actually is what happens. That's actual stuff was really neat for me. The big question I get, and it kind of goes back to My Girl with Jamie Lee Curtis's character coming in to do hair and makeup. Where I am, we have hairdressers that come in, like professional hairdressers that come in, but for the most part, we're the ones doing the makeup. We're the ones doing the dressing. In one of my fun Facebook groups, we call them corpsematologists, people who they just want to get into the funeral industry to do hair and makeup. And it's like, no, you've got to go to school and get your embalmer's license in order to do that for the most part. The other one would be, you're so bubbly. How are you a funeral director? Everybody thinks that I need to be like dark and moody and brooding, and it's not like that at all.
So you mentioned folks who may want to get into the field. I know we saw in the chat that we have someone who is studying death and dying sociology. Are there ways to get in the field other than being a mortician or a funeral director?
We have, we call them FDAs, funeral directors assistants, and they are all ages. We have some who work just solely answering phones, working visitations, directing people around the funeral home. We have a few that work in our care center that deal with transfers and setups. So they'll actually do the transportation from the place of death to us, and then subsequently out to the funeral home that the family has chosen. And you don't need to be licensed to do any of that. So you only really need to be licensed in order to make the arrangements and to physically do the embalming. And that's what you're.
Is there anything fat people need to know as professionals, or as students, if they are interested in this field, ways that they may have a different experience, or what representation looks like amongst your colleagues?
A lot of it has to do with strength, with physical strength. It is a very physical job with moving people, moving caskets. So long as you can do the physical work, your size doesn't matter.
Well, Adrienne, it looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience and are close to our cutoff time. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you want to leave us with?
Just have the conversations. Open up, have those conversations. Find a safe person that is not going to judge you. And if anything might conspire to do fun stuff with you, because you can have fun with planning your funeral in your choices. So just have those conversations and have an open mind.
Adrienne, thank you for your time today and your openness in talking about all of these things and the guidance that you provided us in working on putting together some resources. Thank you once again to our friends at Pro Bono ASL. Our interpreters today were Lex and Lavender. And I want to give a shout out to Trevor Keyson and the Future of NAFA Committee, who worked really hard, including, again, Darlene doing research behind the scenes. Worked really hard on helping put together the death planning resources page, and will continue to work hard on adding. We will be adding information about life insurance as it relates to fat and higher weight people, insurance, information about end of life care, like lots of different information that we'll be continuing to add and build out that resource, because we know it's really important to our community. So once again, if you have suggestions, there is a suggestion form on the page at nafa.org/death planning. And you can enter, any resources or suggestions there at any time. And we'll alert you to updates through our newsletter and through our social media at NAFA Official. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the NAFA webinar series. We have a couple of more virtual events coming up in December as we close out 2022. So please stay tuned to our social media and our newsletter for those things. And just a final thank you to everyone who gives so generously to NAFA in order to allow us to offer events like this free to our community. If you would like to join the ranks of those folks, you can give at nafa.org/give. You can give on Facebook, you can give on Instagram, and you can give through PayPal. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.